The big question I find with AI is like, forget will it replace jobs, forget will it bring people to faster, working more efficiently, working more productively. I guess the big question is like, if you give enough computing power to something, does it become self-aware? Does it become conscious? Does it become sentient? Like, is consciousness uniquely biological, or can you replicate it with machine? And like, I don't think anyone really knows the answer. I don't think anyone will know the answer, because even if it does become alive, we won't really know if it's alive or not.
Yeah, it's kind of coming back to what I was saying of like that AGI, or even fully conscious AI.
Yeah.
We're moving the goalpost as to what we define it to be.
Yeah, we've kind of passed the Turing test, kind of.
We are. We're 100% past it, but we're kind of reconfiguring the Turing test to be like, oh, actually, we didn't understand this really well enough to be able to predict all of these edge cases. So yeah, it is a moving target.
Camille, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Right, so let's go straight into it. You're the co-founder of Plural AI, which you built from just an idea into now a growing fintech platform. So what advice, what tips, what recommendations can you give to other, I guess, startup entrepreneurs, people that want to be where you are, you're maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 steps ahead of them? What should they do? What recommendations would you give to people that want to start their own business?
Yeah, so that's quite a vast question. So I guess maybe let me tell you a little bit about my background and some of the things that are kind of relevant as part of that. So I started my career more like investments, banking, private equity, so kind of finance person, went into that after university. And for me, it was always going to be a stepping stone into wanting to start my own business. I kind of had that in the back of my mind. So maybe that's actually a first tip for other people is to, I think there's lots of different ways to do startups, and some people I know that have jumped straight in from university and just like graduates, and that's like amazing. Yeah. But for me, I felt that I needed to have experience understanding more about the kind of business, wider business models, and so I think finance as a career was, if not necessarily directly relevant for operating a business, at least very relevant to understand the ins and outs of running a business, and particularly, the whole kind of finance side of it, which is, if I look back on what I've done, definitely been one of our strengths as a business is to manage cash and not die, because I've been just really attuned to how to run a business, and that's just been invaluable in terms of cash flow management. Probably a really good skill to have as CEO, even though there's lots of things that I don't do nearly as well. But that I do well. So I would say, kind of having gone through that path and having some sort of very like financial education is really useful. The other bit, what I did is that after coming out of finance proper, I went and worked at another startup, and I joined them after the Series A. Yeah, and they just raised the Series A, and they were about kind of 6 people. I stayed back there for about 2 years, and then when I left, they were double or like 1.5 times number of people, and that was just great to see the kind of the bad, the good, and the ugly about companies. And that was, again, for me, I wanted to have experience seeing it from, what it's like to operate a business, because that's very different from what I was doing before, which was investing in businesses. Yeah. But having seen both sides of the coin, I think kind of equipped me to then start a business. So I didn't, there was a lot of things that I was fairly fluent with in terms of actually, the kind of high level kind of operations of the business, very different from building products, and that's a whole skill set that I had to learn. But that kind of running a business operationally and that kind of stuff, I felt fairly equipped with.
Okay, there's a good point, because a lot of people, you're right, they go into their first business and they don't know a single thing about finance or marketing or sales or whatever, and it's good to have a strong foundation in at least 1 or 2 things, so spending a couple of years working for somebody else to learn the skills, it does help you. I mean, there are some Mark Zuckerberg type figures that come out of the womb coding, and they can just create, epic...
and they're just very lucky as well. We hear about the ones that do succeed, and we don't hear about the ones that kind of fall flat on their face to some extent. I don't know if there are any stats or anything like that about kind of experienced CEOs and founders, and how many there's always this saying about being a founder the second time around is much more, so you're going to be much more successful than the first time. So there is something to do with that. I think for me, I mean, it is my first company, and I definitely there's so many things I would do differently if I were to try again, and hopefully if I do start another company, I would do it much better. Yes. But I think I was able to maybe shortcut some of this because I have seen other businesses being taken over, gone bust and stuff like that, and so I had a little bit of that inkling having had that exposure. but then there's like so many other things that I was wholly underprepared for. So.
Well, the startup, working for a startup is super, super useful, because when you're working for a big corporate, I spent 5 years working for a big corporate, and as important as your job and title might be, you are still a small cog in a huge, huge machine. If you're working for a Series A or a Series B or whatever, they are moving a lot quicker, you know, a lot more agile. You've got to wear many, many different hats, and you will learn more in a year doing that than you would learn in 5 years.
100%, 100%. Yeah, I mean, there's always that expression. I mean, they had that even on like the recruiting page of my company, where it's dog years of in terms of experience, right? Like you learn so much more, and that is definitely true. And I definitely felt it in like the 2 years that I spent there. I had like 3 or 4 different jobs, and they were all like so completely different. And the company, there was like 3 or 4 different versions of the same company. Sure. Now, you know, now that I'm doing it with my own business, it's a whole different level of in terms of involvement, and to some extent it's very difficult to replicate that experience, but the closest you can get to working at another startup, having exposure to that, the better, in my opinion.
Cool. So to build Plural AI, you've raised some money from investors. A lot of people that we speak to on the show, and I guess that listen to the show, they are struggling to raise like their first $1, never mind their millionth or whatever, right? So if it comes to like getting early money, whether it's pre-seed or seed or whatever, what tips would you give to people on how to pitch, on how to approach potential angels or VCs? You know, where are people going wrong? What would you do differently if you began your fundraising today, I suppose?
Yeah. Oh, again, yeah, quite a big topic.
Easy question.
Easy question. Yeah, you're really going with the softballs there. So again, let me just explain a little bit of the context for us. So I started my business, Plural I went through an incubator called Entrepreneur Incubator, Accelerator, whatever you call it. They like to call themselves a deep tech investor, I think. But anyways, Entrepreneur First is kind of this organization that focuses on bringing people together to start businesses from scratch. And the idea is that you join the program, you find people to co-found the company with, and that's how I met my co-founder originally.
Reid Hoffman, so. Yeah.
So it didn't set up, but invest in, yeah. So they set, it was like this team, Matt and Alice, that kind of founded out. They were working at McKinsey at the time. It was a bit of a charity project originally, and then evolved into this actual kind of organization that is now a fund. They have a fund, they invest in companies, all that kind of stuff, and it's like they're building it up. And they're huge now, but back when I did it, I mean, they're still fairly well established, but yeah, they literally just raised money from Reid Hoffman. So these kinds of programs I really recommend, because they are just a really great way to get your name out there, and it's kind of signal theory, right? Like if you get through to the EF program and you get funded by EF, that's literally, they were the first money into our business. They were that kind of initial pre-seed check. Mm-hmm. That gives a signal to other investors, and VCs are all about kind of identifying patterns and stuff like that. And they do have this little bit of like, oh, it's an EF company, therefore it has gone through this kind of cycle of having been vetted, and those companies are going to be higher quality than other ones. You know, there's good businesses everywhere, but that was the thing that worked for us in terms of getting EF to fund our idea from the very beginning. We literally had nothing at that point, all the way through to then investing in us in terms, and then also then opening doors to other investors. So we raised our first checks from mostly from people that we had, within the EF investor network. If I were to do it again, I'm not sure that I would necessarily go and raise, well, that's like a whole question of like raising venture and stuff like that, because that's for the types of businesses that we do, particularly at the time, when we started, which was 2018, there's like the wave, there's a wave of hype around AI and machine learning, but nowhere near what we have now. And so there was something within that in the specialized space, but it was nowhere near that kind of like, general awareness. And so you probably needed, in order to, because there was still quite a large gap between what you could build and what the market needed, you probably needed some venture dollars in order to kind of fund that. So would I have been able to start, I think if I were to start today, there's a lot more that you can do with things out of the box, and, APIs that you can plug into and stuff like that. So there's a lot more that I could probably go with without any venture money, and a lot more that I could do with like my existing network and stuff like that. But it is, I think at the time it made sense. It still makes sense, if you have like very big ambitions. What I quite like, actually, a friend of mine said that the other day to me, and I was like, yes, I definitely want to co-opt that term, is venture strapping. So raising a bit of money from VC, but then bootstrapping for the rest of it, which is basically what we've done. We've kind of raised a little bit of money early on, and then they've been very, very, very focused on getting revenue, particularly in the last couple of years from customers, and that's the best validation you can. And then if and when we do raise another round, we'll come back to that with a lot more validation rather than having just raised money from successive rounds without necessarily having the proof points for it.
This podcast is brought to you by welovealpha.com. If you're looking to grow and hire and scale your software engineering team in the UK, then go to welovealpha.com to hire the best software developers on the market. Everything across Java to C# to PHP to Python to React and Angular and mobile and more. Go to welovealpha.com to hire the best software engineers in the UK now.
Yeah. I think the investing market today in 2024 is very different to what it was a couple of years ago, where if you're looking to raise your next round, you kind of need to be showing some traction in terms of sales. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult.
One big difference that I wanted to add on this compared to when I raised, it was the case already, but I think these days it's a lot more common and a lot more developed, is the angel network. Like, it's much, much more common to raise fairly big rounds actually purely from angels, whereas before it wasn't really the case. You kind of need to have a VC, a couple of institutions, which was our case. Whereas I think today you could gather a lot more, and the sums that you can raise out of pure angel networks would be a lot bigger. So I think if I were to try and do it now, if I were to kind of look for the first checks into the company, I probably would look at that first. Yeah.
Especially like syndicates. I'm part of a couple of angel networks, and we all invest a tiny bit of money each, a couple of grand. But if there's 30 people each putting in, 1 or 2 grand, then suddenly you've got a decent check that you can write to somebody and get an idea off the ground. So
exactly.
Yeah, don't just limit yourself to VC cash. Look at angels, look at friends and family. Try and bootstrap if you can.
Get your clients involved and you invest in. So in our case, and I guess that's going to be different for different sectors, but because we are selling into the finance space, a lot of my network and a lot of my potential clients are also potential investors, right? So I did have a couple of angel checks from people that I ultimately could also then target as customers and that kind of stuff. So it does have pros and cons, because obviously it's a bit, there's a bit of a conflict of interest potentially, but it is a very useful thing to. So definitely if you're looking at those, finance, enterprise, those people might have some cash themselves to invest.
Yeah, and especially when you talk about like SEIS and it's like free money for a lot of people to do. So they're like good incentives to get people on board.
For sure.
Okay, so you mentioned EF a moment ago. Entrepreneur First, you're right, it does have a good reputation. I think is it 5% of companies that apply and get in or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how, but yeah, probably. I mean, the way it works for our cohort, I think there's about 100 people that applied to the program. Oh, sorry, there's probably more, but 100 people that kind of started on the program. Yeah. I think there's about maybe 20 that dropped out, so maybe 80 that found that kind of actually got through and got into companies. So there's about 40 teams roughly, and of those 40 teams, there's about 20 that got funded. And now, let's say a few years later, actually we are a really good cohort for EF in terms of the longevity of the companies. Most of the companies are still going, but there's some, So overall, I think, compared to the number of people that have applied, it was like a tiny fraction of companies to the number of people that originally went through.
Okay. And let me ask a tricky question. Okay. So you went to Oxford, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Oxford University is like the most traditional high-class education you can get. And then Entrepreneur First is like the startup school, like scrappy, it's like for a couple of weeks, but there's some amazing businesses that are being born off the back of them. Okay. So if you could only pick one, I don't know if your Oxford degree was for business or...
No, it wasn't. So I did a master's in something completely different, linguistics.
Linguistics, okay. But if you could only pick one, Oxford or EF, what would...
Oh, that's tough. I think if I were to do it today, I don't know that I would need EF again. Having gone through that experience, I probably would be able to start, but I don't know that I would So
as a second-time founder,
you
already have the network that it's given you.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, because I think what Oxford or any of these universities give you is just a way of thinking, and it's just a way of critical thinking and analytical skills and stuff like that. And I do think that's like an incredibly valuable thing that to some extent EF kind of replicates. If you look at this, Matt and Alice, they definitely are kind of like, Oxbridge type products, and they went through McKinsey, very elitist things. And I'm not there to kind of, harp on the kind of merits of elitism, but there is something around kind of structuring, and that's more like the McKinsey thing, which is kind of harks back to some things that you do at Oxford, is learning how to speak well, how to pitch a narrative, how to kind of express and convey certain ideas, and to critically evaluate things. actually, regardless of it's EF or Oxford, that's the thing I would take away, and that I don't think you necessarily need to go to these, organizations to do that. But I would say, regardless of if you haven't been through one of those, definitely look to build that skill set. 100%. That critical thinking is something I'm really big on generally. So yeah.
Yeah, there's so many like alternative ways to do it nowadays. I mean, I dropped out of uni, but my wife has a PhD, and there's very, very different paths that you can take. I never did an accelerator. I guess the podcast has been my version of like EF kind of. Because
and there's actually a really interesting guy. I mean, not to plug another podcast on your podcast, you can edit
fine.
that out if
No.
need be.
I don't care.
But there's a guy called Alex O'Connor on YouTube. I don't know if you know him. He runs a podcast slash kind of YouTube channel called Cosmic Skeptic, I think. Okay. And his podcast is called Within Reason. Anyways, he graduated from Oxford in philosophy, I think, but he has just been really good at building that, his YouTube brand essentially from early on. And a lot of things that he's like the perfect example of what those kind of slightly alternative careers built through a completely different medium. But he also comes from like this kind of very elitist kind of background, not his personal background because I think he's not that well off or anything like that. But going through Oxford, which, anyways, long story short, I think he really kind of encapsulates that really interesting kind of Venn diagram skill set of like understanding of social media and building new podcasts and new kind of ways of interacting with communities, that kind of critical thinking and stuff like that, and a curiosity in like tackling subjects in a very different way from like what. And so that's exactly the sort of thing that. So anyways, if there's one role model I would point to, maybe
he's a great example, right? I've spoken to a founder or a great investor every single week for 3 years now. I've done like 170 episodes.
Yeah, and you get so much out of that, just conversations, and I think good conversations. And again, that's what you do. That's what the best podcasts do best, and that's why podcasts I think is such an interesting medium. Is having this kind of long form conversation that you don't get to have otherwise. And I think if I look back at all the things that I've learned, the kind of tidbits and stuff like that, they've all come from conversations with other founders, from investors, just having really good conversations where it's not so much of I really hate the kind of pitching format where you kind of on stage demoing. It's nice, there's some like nice feelings about it if you do well and stuff like that, but I don't think you really get much out of it. Much you get much more out of is sitting down, having for coffee, going for coffee. You don't have a deck, you don't have anything, you have a free flowing conversation, you can just talk about random things, and those are like the most productive meetings in my opinion.
Oh, certainly. I found that when with hiring people, like I'd look at their CV for 10 seconds and then I'd go like, all right, so put it away, let's have a chat. And then they'd be like, oh, what do you mean? I need the deck.
People get really like, oh my God, I don't have a script, what do I do? And then people like, but when you're kind of like going past that hand, like actually something we do for hiring is this, what we call this life story interview, where we get to, we actually kind of walk all the way from the beginning of someone's like actually going back to their childhood, what drives them, how did they grow up, what were their role models, like what books did they read, what kind of were they a really sporty one or the nerdy one, or those types, kind of and kind of going through their entire life story and understanding why they make choices. And that I come out, they're quite intense because you're literally going through someone's life, but usually most people, the vast majority of people that I went through, they're like, oh my God, that was so good. I really, almost like a therapy session. And I find those really interesting because I really get to understand what makes them tick. And so that's a good tip for hiring maybe.
Well, let me ask you about hiring, because after you've been through EF and you've got some capital, people will almost always spend a big chunk of that on building their team. I mean, that's like ultimately what you need the money for. Team and I guess cloud credits and like a few other things, right?
Team is definitely the biggest thing.
WeWork, coffee. But team's like, it's certainly my biggest expense, right? What's important to you when building a team? Like what kind of culture are you looking to build? What kind of green flags do you look for? What red flags do you avoid? What's your philosophy when it comes to hiring?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have really kind of structured that into any sort of philosophy because I'm not necessarily the, but it offers definitely some principles. I think for me it is very much about the sort of company that we're trying to build. So at Plural, we kind of have a few different, I mean, we don't really necessarily have values in the way kind of corporate, put it on the wall or anything like that, but we have kind of guiding principles that we're really keen to kind of embed in the company, and that we're key to developing not just the team and values within the company, but also the product, and they actually are really aligned. So for us, there's kind of two things. One is like ask more questions, which actually is our tagline. So it's the thing that, and I see that as like probably the most fundamental principle when I'm just the types of people I like to hang out with, and therefore the types of people I like to work with, is curiosity. So asking questions and just wanting to ask more and more questions. And that is something that I find the biggest predicting well, there's like a lot of different things, but yeah, the biggest predictor of like how good someone is going to be is their willingness to be curious and ask questions and challenge the status quo. And that also happens to be what a product literally enables people to do. Like that's what we see. Our value is like enabling people to ask questions from the data, from whatever things that they weren't able to do. Anyway, so that's kind of one area is like curiosity and intellectual curiosity and wanting to kind of go past that. The other one being look for the desired paths, and that's something where it's like looking for the shortcuts, looking for the things that are going to be slightly different, and the ways to do. You know, if you look at a product again, our industry is like. Finance is like an industry that's like super old school. They have very set ways and they do things in a very specific way. And they're like, okay, we do this, then we do this and this, and they have these 20-step process. And you're like, look at this, be like, wait, hang on, why, you know, you're going this all over? Why, if you go to A to D instead? And they're like, oh, yeah, I guess. And that's the sort of thing of like looking at things in a slightly different way. So anyway, so I look for those two traits for people that I hire. I try to understand what makes them tick, and I go through that whole kind of life story interview, particularly with more kind of senior hires. And then I look for people that are intellectually curious and looking to, and are capable of asking those questions that slightly challenge the status quo. There's a lot of other things in terms of what we actually test, particularly if they're engineers or anything, but in terms of personal fits, that's the sort of thing I look for.
What about red flags? Is there anything in particular where if you see it on a CV or it happens in an interview, you're like, oh, I can't get past that?
It's interesting because I've had a number of different interviews in the past, and I can think of some people that said things in an interview that I think should, you know, normally would have been red flags. Okay. But I think in the context of it, actually, they, you know, and I was actually very happy with their, you know, their performance. I can think of one person in particular that said something in the interview that probably should have disqualified them, maybe. But actually, they turned out to be an incredibly, you know, an amazing employee for the years that they were with us.
It's hard, right?
And then and vice versa. Then people that do really, really well in interview that turn out to be completely, you know, like super manipulative or political animals, and you're like, so it's hard. I think for me, the interview is only the beginning process of evaluating someone. I don't come out of an interview and I'm like, I mean, I can say, yes, I really like them, but I know in the back of my mind that I'm like, that's just the one very, very, you know, carefully crafted and curated image of a person, and I will not know what they're like until they actually come on the job. So what I like to do is, I mean, it's something that, you know, people like to do, but it's kind of hire fast, fire fast. And I'm very, very ruthless about not keeping on board people if I don't think that they perform well, or if I think that they're kind of toxic in some way. Sometimes it's easier to you know, action than others, but I kind of see the recruiting process just, it's going to be a very partial information that you have on the person.
I love the hire fast, fire fast. I also would add like promote fastest, because you want to get the best people through the door. You want to hire them quickly. You want to snap them up before the competition does. But if they're not the right fit, you need to not waste their time. You know, let them find an opportunity where they can thrive. You know, and you know, let them go. But then if you want to keep them, if they're good, promote them. Like, don't like have some ridiculous 2-year time frame where they've got to hit all these targets. You know, like if they're doing the job, then give them the next.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I can think of some people like that have come out like and been incredibly, you know, high performing, and you know, you want to fast track those people for sure.
Okay, so let's switch gears to AI. You're building an AI focused company and product and platform. What are your thoughts on, I guess, the future of artificial intelligence?
How much time do you have? That could be an entire podcast. I don't know. It's interesting because, like, in some ways, I feel like people that are in that space building companies and stuff like that, sometimes it's so hard to kind of, you know, step back and evaluate the broader space because you're so focused on your like internal, you know, implementations, whatever. Yeah. And you kind of like, you almost like have to tune out the noise because there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of things happening, and it's just almost like distracting to when you're building a company. So in AI, and there's like different types of companies, right? Like there's like the foundational AI, kind of very R&D focused, you know, the sort of thing that actually we used to do a lot more of. And then you have the much more kind of applied AI, you know, that are much more about, let's take, you know, they're very capable people, but they take like existing bits and pieces and then craft it together into a new product. So yeah, and I think we've kind of moved from that, the kind of former, you know, we used to actually do a lot of work developing our models and stuff like that, doing a lot of R&D and that actually a big learning for us was to the company to be successful was actually the latter space is really where we needed to be and develop much more of an emphasis on the product. And the product so happens to have AI into it, but it's like AI as in the service of a bigger outcome. So Yeah, so I don't know what I'm trying to, what's the kind of bigger learning. I don't know that I really necessarily have one at this stage. Maybe I will in a couple of years' time once I've, like we've, on the side of that wave. I think one thing that I have been through a couple hype cycles already of AI, and so I think I'm very philosophical, and I'm like, yeah, that whatever is happening now is useful from a marketing standpoint, but I'm also like not really getting my hopes up or anything like that. I think there's already like some signs that this current hype cycle might be kind of on the down, and so for us it's just going to be another way of like, we're going to have to find our way through that. So for me, it's much more about what is the value that I'm providing to my users. And what is the end outcome that I'm trying to drive? What is the value to them? And that may or may not be delivered by AI. It so happens that AI helps, but really, what is the value? And so I think, and particularly for an applied AI company, it's maybe a bit easier to just really focus on what customers want and what users want, and just go back to that again and again and again and again. And I've tried pitches where it's much more about, it's all about AI and how it's going to revolutionize and everything, but actually A, it didn't feel authentic to me, and B, I don't think it really kind of landed. It can't land as well as something that is really crafted for your customers. And so you can impress maybe an innovation team or someone on like an investor or something, but when it comes to actually selling, my customers don't really, they have questions about AI, they like the fact that we do X, Y, and Z, but really it's all about, how is it going to help me drive these outcomes for my business? Yes. So it's always kind of coming back to that.
This is a quick message to tell you about Alpha University. Alpha University is an advanced training program to help you reach success in 7 simple steps. I am going to personally coach you so that you can achieve your goals, make more money, and transform your life. Just go to joinalphauniversity.com now, or click the link in the description. Yeah, it's business basics and fundamentals. Are you adding more value than it costs them to buy the product?
Exactly. It's still a business like
People
another.
People forget, don't they? They get caught up in the hype.
So it's something that I am also, but I'm worried that this lens that I have is, somewhat biased because I am just so, AI is just another tool, and it's just not. So right now, those things that you can do with AI, there's still a big gulf between, what you can do, the promise of this technology of it being like a revolutionary and stuff like that, and what we can do day to day. And I think there's like the big gap. There's not so much, I think there's a technological gap, but I think it's much more of an implementation, particularly, there's like a big, for us, we sell into enterprise, and just enterprise, in order for them to get their ducks together and just like ducks in a row and get them to actually integrate something, develop and deploy something, it just takes years. And so there's like this natural, it's going to take a while to really trickle down to something that can actually be used. Then there's like the bigger kind of societal impact and what you do with all of that, productivity gains and stuff like that. And so, there might be, some clients tell me, I might just, eliminate entire teams. Or there's some that I'm like, actually I will redeploy. So we're still really early in knowing what the impact will be societally on the part of those technologies. I'm a little, I'm almost like I don't have time to really ask myself those questions because I'm building a business, and it's almost like it's beyond my, it's not my day job. There might be someone in the armchair that can philosophize about this, but I'm like, I'm just building, so I don't really care as much. I am thinking I should care more, and I should have more of a developed kind of idea on this. But in the what I'm saying in the weeds, we're so far from like actually having a big impact that I don't know. I don't really see it as like a threat. It might be that. I think the one thing that does, and the kind of next thing is that when you have autonomous agents that can actually kind of work cross-platform, which is right now, they are still very kind of like, focused on one type of application. Once you start to have autonomy in that and something that is, cross-channels, that's where you have a little bit more of a broader impact that can be had. But still, I think that it's one of those where like, 2 years, you might overestimate what we can achieve in 2 years, underestimate what we can achieve in 10. I don't know yet where we're in that cycle.
What about when we get to that decade point though, and we achieve, for lack of a better term, like AGI, right? And it's no longer about taxi drivers being replaced by self-driving cars or graphic designers being replaced by Mid-Journey, point 7 or 8 or whatever it will be. What if it's like accountants or lawyers or salespeople or customer service or God forbid founders? Like what if you can build a bot that replaces those jobs?
I think there's a couple of kind of things that need to happen for that to be even the case. There's like a whole kind of regulatory, changes that would need to happen. So, you still, AI and AGI or not. I think AGI is like, well, I think there's a whole point of like AGI is actually a moving goalpost when it comes to actually the definition of AGI, something that, so what we call today AI still, and we're saying, oh, it's not AGI. If you'd submitted it to the Turing test 50 years ago, people would be like, oh, this is AGI. But actually, as the technology's progressed, we have moved our definition of what AGI means, because we're like, this is still not AGI, this is still not, this is still not. So I don't know if that is it in the asymptotes where it will never get to that point or not. Difficult to. Anyway, so that's like almost like a technical point about what AGI means. But putting that aside, AI as it stands is still a technology. It's still a means of production that needs to be owned by a physical person or a moral person, but that is still in the realm of it is owned by a human or a company or whatever. And so you still have humans in control of the bigger thing, right? So regardless of how those technologies evolve, they're still within the legal, accounting, financial framework. There still are things that you use, that humans use. And so it might mean more accumulation of capital and resources to specific people and specific, corners of because they have more and more control. And so a founder tomorrow won't need an entire team of developers. They can literally do everything themselves. So it might just mean it's a lot easier to start companies for a lot of people, right? Because they can do things that they wouldn't have been able to 10, 20 years ago. Or it might mean that actually, founders are out of business because it's now all big corporations that do everything. I don't know. I don't know. It's very hard to say anything of really of substance on it. There's lots of things that could happen.
Entering the unknown, aren't we? And everyone's guessing, everyone's making predictions, but nobody really knows what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I don't want to. I don't know that there's anything that we can say really productively on it. I think actually coming back to the kind of Oxbridge discussion of before is something that I've seen mentioned a couple of times, that soft skills and humanities will become a lot more important, because you don't need to program if you have Copilot that does everything for you, but there isn't necessarily that critical thinking, understanding, like speaking and interacting with language becomes a lot more important, because that's potentially where, and actually I've seen that proposed by a few people, where you would have, it's a much more efficient pair to have an AI agent and then a human that knows really well how to interface with it, and offer that as a combo to, instead of having someone that's not as educated interact directly with the AI, because there's a bit of an interface problem. Whereas if you have that kind of combo, that's usually one of the more efficient ones. So you might actually have a whole need for people that know how to write really well, how to craft really well. We're seeing that already with prompt engineering, but there's kind of that what used to be like very STEM focused as a society could now move back to a humanities focused industry. So that could be an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think those kinds of jobs, whether it's like sales or relationship driven roles, they'll be like the last to go, because people still want that human interaction. And maybe there will be a day where there's some 11 Labs type bot which is better than a human, but I think people kind of like that sole idea of like them speaking to somebody, and it's not some chatbot basically. But if I ever go on a website and it's got like a intercom type chatbot on the right side, like pops up, the first thing I'll type in is like human, because I just want to speak to a human, like fundamentally.
Yeah, that's interesting, because like if anything, it's created new kind of patterns of behavior when it comes to interacting with these, because you're like, oh, that you're interacting with something and you don't know the level of intelligence of those, and it's like it's probably still like kind of old school bots, so you're kind of navigating your way. But yeah, it is creating more pain than it's necessarily solving, because you have slightly substandard kind of interactions. An interesting thing that I was seeing as well is kind of potential of reshoring a lot of things that it used to be a lot cheaper to offshore things to to other countries, stuff like that. But actually now that you can equip humans with technology, you could reshore activities, and it would be a lot more efficient to potentially have a call center that is based in the US as opposed to the Philippines. But equip them with more technology, and it will be a lot cheaper to run in these countries, and you'd have a much better user experience. So
yeah, I can see that being a possibility. The big question I find with AI is like, forget will it replace jobs, forget will it bring people to faster, working more efficiently, working more productively. I guess the big question is like, if you give enough computing power to something, does it become self-aware? Does it become conscious? Does it become sentient? Like, is consciousness uniquely biological, or can you replicate it with machine? And like, I don't think anyone really knows the answer. I don't think anyone will know the answer, because even if it does become alive. We won't really know if it's alive or not.
Yeah, it's kind of coming back to what I was saying of like that AGI, that or even fully conscious AI. We're moving the goalposts as to what we define it to be.
Yeah, we're kind of past the Turing test, kind of.
We are. We're 100% past it, but we're kind of reconfiguring the Turing test to be like, oh, actually, we didn't understand this really well enough to be able to predict all of these edge cases. So yeah, it is a moving target. I don't know that it really necessarily makes sense. I think if anything, it would be a different type of, I think, the models of today are very powerful, very human-like, but they're also not human in their consciousness, right? Like they just function very, very differently. So I think even if you were to approximate the same results, they would just come at it from two completely different perspectives. So even if there's any sort of consciousness, it will be a different type of consciousness. I don't know that you can really compare it, because it will just be good at different things. It's very, very good at certain things, but not necessarily in the same way that we do. So yeah.
I guess a large reason the question's asked is because people are worried, like, hey, if it does become alive, are we going to become the apes and they become the humans? And, Well,
I think there's a big thing, and the thing that you still don't see much, and I actually see that as a potential big next kind of step before we really see anything, is AIs right now are kind of like, these kind of like disembodied in a box kind of things. You don't necessarily have as much AI interacting with the real world, and until they can really interact with the real world, they can actually drive. So you have driverless cars, but they're not necessarily, and this is actually a much harder problem than people have anticipated. It's one of those that still hasn't been cracked, and if anything, is being rolled back a little bit. So you don't have AI agents yet in the real world interacting. I think you won't really see much right now. They still are very controllable, and they're still within the software world. I think there's a whole host of things that need to happen in the hardware world before they really become things that we can interact with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, there's a lot happening there. Like Figured have got their second robot coming out soon. Like the Tesla bot, obviously Boston Dynamics. There's so much like cool stuff happening. It's so fun to like watch it from the sidelines and be like, wow.
Yeah, and I think that's where you will see, and there's a ton of. It's interesting because hardware used to be, as a category, not something that people wanted to invest in and because it's really hard and all that kind of stuff. Whereas now there's like a lot of excitement and a really cool thing happening in that space. So yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing that I would watch in the next 5-10 years for sure. But I think there's still a lot to be done right now. What we're doing in the software space, there isn't really that potential to get to AGI because you don't have that sensory inputs, and it's kind of lacking it can't really interact with the whole world. So how can you really say it's conscious or anything when it doesn't have senses?
Sure. Okay. Easy questions.
Go on.
Cool. Well, look, I could talk about AI for hours and hours and hours, but for people that have enjoyed this and they want to learn more about your AI product, what's the website? Where should they go? And I guess who is it built for?
Yeah, I mean, so website is plural.ai or pluralia.com, but plural.ai is the one. So in terms of our product, I mean, we are building it for finance organizations, right? So we are selling to, investment banks, private equity funds, asset managers, those types of people. So it's not a product necessarily for everyday use, but I'm always happy to talk to people in that space or, looking to build other things. So we definitely are kind of a fintech company, but we're a software and data company into selling into the finance vertical.
Cool. And if people want to reach out to you, whether that's founders or investors or whoever, I guess LinkedIn probably.
Yeah, LinkedIn's the best, and my email is it's my name at plural.ai, so it's pretty easy to reach out to me. If anyone has any questions, comments, always happy to hear.
Cool, amazing. All right, Camille, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching this podcast. Make sure that you like, subscribe, follow, comment, etc., and I'll see you in the next episode.